Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Sudan, a call for awareness and action, hosted by Maruf City and CT for Sudan. Maruf City, Muslim Advocacy for Rights, Unity, and Fairness, a Connecticut organization that aims to empower Connecticut's Muslim community to engage in shaping policy, foster unity, celebrate diversity, and collaborate with partners to advocate for and elect leaders who reflect our values and champion human rights and democracy in Connecticut and abroad. CT for Sudan is a community-led group in Connecticut dedicated to raising awareness about the crisis in Sudan, amplifying Sudanese voices, and mobilizing people to take meaningful action through education, advocacy, and solidarity. We are pleased to welcome two distinguished speakers who will provide insight into war in Sudan and discuss important actions we can take to advocate for and support Sudanese. Our first speaker, Suad Abdel, is founder and executive director of Decolonize Sudan, a Sudanese American lawyer, human rights lawyer. She was born and raised in Hasahisa, Sudan. At Decolonize Sudan, she documents abuses within reports and articles, creates educational materials, and leads advocacy training throughout the US. Suad has supported human rights defenders across the Global South and has worked with organizations such as the Southern Center for Human Rights, the National Lawyers Guild, and Palestine Legal, advising activists facing repression for their advocacy. Suad calls on Sudanese organizers to move beyond NGO saviorism and toward principled, people-powered solidarity rooted in justice, memory, and self-determination. Our second speaker, Dr. William Lawrence, is Director of North Africa Area Studies and Senior Academic and Research Fellow in Residence at the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations and a Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown University and across several U.S. government agencies. Dr. Lawrence is a seasoned expert on Sudan and the wider Middle East and North Africa with over 30 years of diplomatic and analytical experience. He teaches courses primarily on U.S. relations with the Muslim world, international affairs, and the comparative politics of the Middle East and North Africa, including developing case studies on Sudan and simulations on the conflict there. Dr. Lawrence worked closely with the U.S. Sudan envoy, John Godfrey, and while serving on the State Department's Libya desk, he helped negotiate a humanitarian aid corridor through southern Libya to support civilians in Darfur. Today's webinar will be moderated by Yasmin and Vina, who will take our questions away right now. Thank you, Yasmin and Vina.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Greetings of peace to our guest speakers and all of our viewers. This webinar will likely be a learning opportunity for myself first, as well as for many of our viewers. I really appreciate both of you sharing your time with us tonight. Sister Yasmin and myself will be asking you both some questions throughout the webinar, but I first want to get started by asking you both if you could give like a 4 to 5 minute update, a brief statement on the war in Sudan before we dive a little bit deeper into the questions that we had prepared for you. So, Sister Suad, I'd like to start with your comment. If you could go ahead, please.
Salam, peace, greetings of peace to everyone in the call. Thank you so much for holding this space and for your enthusiasm and time to learn about Sudan and also to mobilize for Sudan. So what's happening in Sudan, it currently is often described as a civil war, but that framing deeply understates and in fact obscures the reality. Sudan is facing a genocide and total state collapse driven by a heavily armed militia. This private militia group called the Rapid Support Forces, made up of mercenary fighters, violently seized much of Sudan in 2023, starting in April of 2023, and over the course of over 2.5 years, almost 3 years now to date. Since then, this militia has destroyed and leveled the bulk of Sudan's infrastructure, displaced over a third of the population, has waged a campaign of genocide and ethnic cleansing marked by mass killings, sexual violence, and deliberate starvation of entire communities. This resulting in the worst humanitarian crisis in modern history. What makes this crisis distinct is the scale of the destruction that Sudanese civilians are facing, paired with a total abandonment from the international community, and in fact, impunity for this militia and their funders. Sudan, of course, is now facing the largest displacement crisis in the world, one of the largest in modern history, the worst hunger emergency globally, a complete collapse of the healthcare, education, and all basic infrastructure, and especially within the past months, civilians have been facing brutal annihilation by this militia. This militia is doing this in order to take control of the land and the resources. There's a clear profit motive underlying in all of this that is essential in understanding this as a colonial siege of resources and of land. And it's only able to do this because due to the backing of its main funder, its main operations coordinator, its main provider of fighters, which is the United Arab Emirates, who provides the bulk of the funds, the fighters, and the weapons for this militia. And in exchange, the United Arab Emirates receives, is able to smuggle gold en masse from Sudan, is able to smuggle agricultural resources en masse from Sudan, its export economy is based on the theft of resources of Sudanese resources, and so the United Arab Emirates seeks to, has this lies within a larger geopolitical context of the United Arab Emirates seeking to expand as an imperial force, and through the theft of African resources and the destabilization of African countries. So the UAE, we must be clear though, is acting as a client state of the United States because it was created in 1971 as a client state for the United States and for the UK. And the United States, whose global war on terror intends to destabilize and take control of all Muslim countries in order to control the foreign policy of these countries, which was very evident post-Arab Spring. When we talk about Sudan, we must understand it within a larger geopolitical context, must understand the external actors involved here, because that is central to what's the colonial siege that's currently taking place to Sudan. But I also must emphasize that Sudanese people are not passive victims in this story. From the beginnings, civilians have organized emergency response rooms, mutual aid networks, and resistance committees. This was during the revolutionary period to keep people alive in the absence of, and to keep people mobilized and conscious in the absence of a functioning state. And many of these same Sudanese people took up arms and have taken up arms now against the militia that is destroying our communities. And so, it's important to understand Sudanese agency and Sudanese power here, but no community can withstand genocide alone. What's happening in Sudan is not inevitable, it's not ancient, it's not the result. It's the result of deliberate political choices and and a lack of accountability, and an ability for these actors to operate with complete impunity in the international stage. And so it must be addressed through accountability of these actors.
Thank you so much, Suad. I'm sure that when we get into more of the questions, we'll dive a little deeper into some of the things that you mentioned, like those emergency response rooms. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Lawrence, can you give us a brief statement on Sudan as well?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Welcome.
All right, so I'm just going to put myself on camera for a moment. I'm in my car unexpectedly, so I'll be speaking from my car, and just pay attention to the road. I'll turn my camera off. But obviously, her presentation was excellent. I agree with just about everything she said, especially the first part. I'm going to look a little more at the international context. I just got back from the Doha Forum, where Sudan was very much on the agenda. There are a couple things that surprised me at the Doha Forum this year. First of all, how much UAE bashing that was going on. Normally, you know, there's a certain amount of, since the 2018 crisis between UAE, Saudi, and Qatar, there's a certain amount of respect for and care taken when it comes to UAE. But people were so unhappy with UAE's behavior in Sudan, behavior in Yemen, behavior with new forms of criminality and all types of theft from Sudan and trafficking, that there was overt UAE bashing going on, which could portend, you know, a little better in terms of diplomacy going forward for the conflict. Now, we were on the verge of at least a statement that could have led to a peace deal after the London conference in early September. And then everything fell apart after the Fasher events and the relaunch of a full-blown genocide beyond anything we've seen even in the Sudan conflicts before. That was heartbreaking and unstoppable. And the international aid agencies were shocked because when they started to rush in aid, there were very few people to give aid to because so many have been slaughtered with the latest developments in Fasher. I'm also reminded after the Doha Forum and discussing people about the history of it, so I'm a bit of an expert on the Arab Spring. I studied it in many countries and the sort of 1.0 and 2.0 Arab Spring that happened in Sudan. And after the 2019 events in Sudan, there was a lot of hope. But the deal that the protesters and the NGOs aligned with them got was flawed. And I remember we had meetings at where I was teaching at the time at George Washington University in DC, and we were pointing out how flawed the deal was and how easy it would be to claw back the gains, the democratic gains. And I was amazed at the time how sanguine the Sudanese activists were and how sure they were that they had turned a page and that Sudan was moving towards democracy. Therefore, when 2021, the sort of first coup happened and the 2023 war broke out, those of us that study international peacemaking and also democratic transitions weren't shocked at all because the 2019 deal had been so flawed and there were very few guarantees for the Sudanese population in it. But nobody imagined the scale of the civil war, and nobody thought that it would relaunch the genocide in Darfur, and nobody thought that all of these ceasefires all around Sudan from conflicts that, if you look at the history, Sudan since 1969 has been in a civil war or a civil conflict every year but 11. So basically 90% of its independence history, there's been a conflict somewhere in Sudan, and that, you know, there are all these different, front lines and ceasefires and even UN peacekeepers, stationed in various places around Sudan from these previous conflicts, but it sort of all fell apart and it all got swept up in the 2023 war, which was devastating and much worse than any of us expected. The sessions on Sudan at the Doha Forum were not sanguine. Everybody was saying that things would get worse before they get better. I don't know if you've been following this, but there have been Ukrainian mercenaries and Russian forces in Sudan smuggling gold out. You can watch the YouTube videos about what's going on, I think the next big point I want to make that came out of the discussion is that, we used to think, African solutions for African problems, that a Sudan deal between the two generals would solve this. Now the proxy battling and the international dimensions of the conflict are so severe, and the devastating attacks on civilians so out of control, that the consensus in Doha was there has to be an international solution. That it almost has to start with an international solution before you can ever get to the point where you're forcing the two sides to get back together. What's worse now than the previous many years of conflicts in Sudan? It's that we're sort of at a scorched earth level now. When this war broke out, it was, two generals fighting over who would control the military and the economy of Sudan, because the economy is so linked to who's ever in charge through the predatory means that the government uses to control all the different aspects of this economy that are valuable. Now, the sides are so dug in, the atrocities are so atrocious, the war crimes are so shocking, and the international parties are so invested that it's going to take the international community to stop the international meddling in Sudan. We're way past a deal between the generals. Another aspect of this, which builds on what Suad said, is not only do we have this massive displacement crisis, not only do we have this destruction of infrastructure, but a lot of Sudanese have no homes that go home to. I've been working on a number of Sudanese asylum cases because I do asylum work. And when the U.S. government contemplates sending back asylum seekers to Sudan, one of the first questions I'm answering in my affidavit says, there is no home to go to. In many cases, there's no neighborhood to go back to. There's nothing. There's nothing left where a lot of these people came from, given the scorched earth tactics of the two sides. If I could say one positive thing, and this is true throughout the years of peacemaking in Sudan, is that Sudanese don't want the country to divide again. And Sudanese population and a lot of the leaders know how to talk to each other. They know how to make peace deals. They know how to get along if the conditions are right, if they're exhausted enough from fighting. There's a famous story that Alex DeWall, the big Sudan expert, told recently about the peacemaking that Jimmy Carter did on his first trip to the region in the 1990s. And he was sort of racked with anticipation and fear about how to get the two sides even talking. And he went into the room where the negotiation was supposed to start, and they started without him, and everything was going fine. And I've seen this among Sudanese, that if you sort of remove the political pressures and the outside players, Sudanese know how to talk to each other. They know how to make peace. But in this case, it's going to be difficult. And one of the reasons we had the coup of 21 and the outbreak of war in 23 was because of the previous war crimes going back to 2019 and 21, involving the current forces, particularly the RSF that Suad talked about so wonderfully, that need to be brought to account, made accountable, and held to account. The problem is that if people are fighting not to be arrested, like we have with Netanyahu in a different sense in Israel, they won't give up arms. They won't stop fighting. And so I think one of the painful things when we look at Sudan right now, as NGOs have to gather the evidence of war crimes and have to, document the atrocities that have occurred and hold as many people to account as possible, that the top people will probably never be held to account and probably can't be held to account because they'll need to be forced into exile, like we've seen in other conflicts, rather than held to account by the local authorities. And I don't think that's always a bad thing. If the way you bring a conflict to an end is simply allow the people who have been perpetrating, massive atrocities on the other side, a genocide, sometimes that's better than forcing them to remain in conflict because they're afraid of the international justice and the domestic justice that could be held against them. One more point on the state. The state has virtually collapsed in many parts of Sudan. Yes, there's some areas in the east and the north which are functioning with some degree of normality, but in the conflict areas, there is no state in many respects. And so as we talk about rebuilding Sudan, it's not just about a ceasefire and mobilizing resources for rebuilding of the country and its infrastructure, but we're going to have to rebuild the state itself with the amount of killing that's going on, with the amount of dismantling of political entities. You'll, in many respects, you'll have to start over. So that has to be part of the conversation. Let me stop there, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence. Thank you. As we dive a little bit deeper, if we can kind of keep our comments down to maybe 4 minutes, because we have quite a few questions to get through, but that was very, very helpful. Sister Yasmin, you want to ask your question?
Thank you so much for that. So my question is actually for Saad. So for our audience who may not know the history of the Sudanese Armed Forces or SAF or the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, can you talk a little bit more about who these groups are and what their motives are? Oh, you're muted.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So just quickly before I get to some of the history, that when the Dr. William Lawrence talks about the atrocities that have happened in Al-Fashid, just want to make sure we name who is doing the atrocities and what's happening. Earlier this year, the Sudanese military was able to oust the RSF from the main regions within central and eastern Sudan, in which the RSF had previously entrenched. The RSF militia had entrenched itself, and so the RSF shifted into the strategy of annexing the west of Sudan, of taking Darfur, Kordofan, and the Nuba Mountains, with the larger goal of taking over all of Sudan, but first annexing the west, because their military, the UAE military bases that they operate out of, are located in Chad and come through the west. And so it's much more militarily strategic for the RSF to take over the west first. And how will they take over the west? They've been letting us know for over a year now that they would go in and they would annihilate the Sudanese people throughout the west of Sudan in order to take control of this land and these resources. And so 2 months ago, after receiving a supply of sophisticated UAE weaponry, the militants took over the city of Al-Fashir, and they executed one of the largest mass killing events of the 21st century. They killed, it's a city of 250,000 people, and they executed an extermination campaign that is said to have killed most of the population, if not all of the population. They left some women and girls who were violently assaulted and were left to drag the bodies of their husbands, their brothers, their fathers into the trenches where the RSF had trapped civilians within a starvation kill box for months leading up to this extermination campaign, where those women then were forced to burn the bodies of their loved ones in order for the RSF to hide the extent of their crimes. The RSF now has a stronghold on Darfur and the West and is looking to entrench itself across Sudan. Its next target, as it has stated, and as it has been stating, is the Kurdistans. And specifically, we're looking at similar levels of annihilation in the capital of North Kurdistan, Al Ubaid. The RSF is using the same language that they used around Al Fashir leading up to this. So we know what's going to happen. The RSF is going to go in and is going to annihilate the civilian population unless it is stopped. And they've already begun massacres across Kurdistan. In fact, 3 days ago, they went into this is a militia that specifically targets civilians, that is not an armed force. We know this because 3 days ago, they went into a city that has no military presence, and they killed over 100 babies within a nursery. So this is the kind of barbarity that this entity, this genocidal militia that has no legitimate governance authority or force is conducting. So to understand just really quickly, because this is a lengthy history, but I would encourage you to go to decolonizesudan.org to look at, we have many resources that really get into history, especially in how both of these entities were formed and leading up to the revolutionary period in 2019. But it's important, if you don't take anything outside of this, it's important to understand that the Sudanese Armed Forces, or the SAF, is Sudan's formal national military. It has historically been tied to authoritarian rule and military governance because all leaders, with the exception of one, post-colonial leaders, were military generals, and that took power through military coup. And so the large, the demands of Sudanese people was and remains that the military go back to the barracks, that it be a fighting force for Sudan and not a source of governance or a state institute. It's a state institution, but it's not a force of governance. The RSF is fundamentally different. It is a militia force. It is a private militia force that operates for profit, and whose fighters are made up of mostly mercenary fighters that are paid in. Some of those Ukrainian and Colombian mercenaries that Dr. William Lawrence were mentioning, it's very important to understand this. So the UAE is the reason why there's so much focus on the UAE is not because there's this like kind of, if you look at, so many external actors involved, it's just so confusing. Why emphasize the UAE? Well, the UAE is the operational coordinator. Those Colombian mercenaries, those Ukrainian mercenaries, the Ethiopian mercenaries, the Chadian mercenaries are all going through the UAE network. They're being paid. There's proof, or especially around the Colombian mercenaries, that they're being paid. They're being flown in. They're being given UAE passports. They're being flown in through UAE flights in through the neighboring countries that the UAE has bases in. And so without the UAE, the RSF would fall. It would not be able to operate it would not be able to operate. It would not be able to undertake the genocide and the illegal occupation that it is undertaking. It's really important to, and around peace building, I want to create a metaphor. If Wagner Group were to invade or come and entrench itself within the U.S. And a militia force, a private militia force, and we found out that North Korea was funding Wagner Group to do this and arming Wagner Group to do this. The UN, the international response would be very clear: sanction North Korea, arms embargo on North Korea, get this militia, this terroristic militia, out of this country. So we ask for the same diplomatic responses to Sudan, despite it being an African nation, despite its positionality with being within this neo-colonial system that seeks to control African politics and doesn't see African sovereignty as an important, and a reality. So I just want to emphasize the why so many Sudanese people are opposed to Western-led peace talks around Sudan that give legitimacy to this militia and do not hold the UAE accountable.
You so much for that. And just to for everyone else, if you have questions, please put it on the chat. And I'll move on to our next question, which is also for both of you, Dr. Lawrence and Saad. So Sudan's economic collapse, inflation, loss of revenue, and total infrastructural breakdown has intensified the humanitarian crisis caused by the genocide and ongoing conflict. Could you both speak to the impact of international sanctions? And I know you both touched on some of these. Sudan is extreme debt and how these factors have shaped the crisis.
Suad, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think especially around the humanitarian efforts, there has been a complete abandonment of Sudan. And a lot of this abandonment was around U.S. aid, the pulling of U.S. aid, because the U.S. has historically, throughout Sudan's post-colonial history, been the main provider of aid, and it very intentionally positioned itself to be the main provider of aid and developmental loans, so that there is a control of Sudan's foreign policy. This is the U.S.'s foreign policy throughout the African continent, to provide aid with the intention of control of foreign policy, because you can always pull aid when the country is not aligned with the foreign policy that you're seeking. So when the Trump administration pulled, so leading up to this, Sudan's economy was dependent on this aid, for it to be, so when the Trump administration went in and pulled the entirety of U.S. aid, and at the moment of most need for Sudanese people, not to mention doing an immigrant ban on Sudan in the moment of the largest displacement of Sudanese people on earth, and now detaining Sudanese people in ICE facilities throughout the U.S. That have recently fled from genocide, it's not only inhumane, but it is unlawful. These are asylum seekers, and they have international, right to seek asylum. But nonetheless, despite the total abandonment at the international level of humanitarian aid for Sudan at the time of most need for civilians, Sudanese civilians themselves built these extraordinary systems of survival, because we are a resilient people and because we need to in order to survive. And so emergency response rooms, or ERRs, which were neighborhood-based, volunteer-run networks, and community kitchens, similarly, that were formed by doctors, teachers, youth organizers, and resistance committees themselves. So the resistance committees of the revolutionary period quickly shifted their operations into community kitchens and emergency response rooms for their people's survival, because this is the basic needs of their people that they were facing. So they coordinated food distribution, medical care in the midst of total healthcare collapse, evacuations, and information sharing, documenting, reporting, and especially in the midst of telecommunications blackouts, sharing information amongst communities so that the information would get out. And diaspora networks were really vital in this in these mutual aid efforts, because diaspora, every single Sudanese person that you know has been affected by this genocide and this conflict within this past 2.5 years. Every Sudanese person you know is likely supporting a whole family back in Sudan, if their family was not displaced externally, but nonetheless they're still supporting their families even when they're displaced. I say this to say the diaspora has been the foundation of the getting funding to those on the ground that are coordinating these survival efforts. It shouldn't be up to diaspora. I shouldn't have to think about my whole neighborhood back in Hashaisa for their survival. These international NGOs that parachuted in the early 2000s, and then very quickly abandoned in 2023 as soon as conflict hit, because they are not from that region. These NGOs, these international organizations, should be responsible, and of course, states have a responsibility to be preventing starvation, to be preventing these civilian deaths, and so it's important to understand grassroots groups, women-led collectives, local mutual aid groups. These are the groups and the communities that have allowed the Sudanese people to survive in the midst of unspeakable horrors, in the midst of the worst humanitarian crisis happening in the world today. I think it's really important to emphasize here to support those grassroots systems wherever you can. We have, again, on our website, a list of different grassroots initiatives that you can plug into and support. So I hope that you'll check those out.
I'm unmuting myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So a couple things. First of all, I'd like to finish some of the things that Suad started to talk about but didn't finish maybe her thought, and then address the question. First of all, on the RSF, the way to think of the RSF is that it is, for the most part, the genocide militias that perpetrated the first and second Darfur genocides. It's the same people from those much older Sudanese conflicts that are back up to the same atrocities they were committing in the past, except that it's much worse now, in part because of what Suad said. The lethality of the weapons is worse, and the impunity is worse. Let me also correct one thing that I said. I said 69. Actually, independence of Sudan was in 56, 69 years of independence, of which 11 had peace, and all of the rest of it had either regional or national level civil wars. And so that's created a lot of things, including a certain amount of resilience from Sudanese people that know how to survive in war situations. But it's also created dysfunctionalities and, let's say, war economics, which aren't normal economics, and profiteering that goes on in wartime that settles back in quite easily when wars break out again. Let me also say that Wagner Group changed its name to Africa Corps, and it's in some ways it's worse than it was before. And that on Fasher, she mentioned Fasher. We don't know if most of 250,000 people were killed in Fasher, but we know that it was at least tens of thousands. And it's a war crime to kill one civilian in nearly all circumstances. We're talking about tens of thousands of people killed in days. That's, to use a crude term, industrial strength killing. That's a level of killing previously the Genja, we couldn't have done it that quickly. So the level and speed and industrial strength again of the killing is just unprecedented and ferocious and unwarranted and beyond shocking. Worse than Gaza, much worse. And everyone who knows me knows I'm a huge critic of what's going on in Gaza. This is worse. Now, let me say that Suad's exactly right about the twin worsenings of the Trump administration around the cutting of all the humanitarian assistance at first and very little restoration, and the arresting of Sudanese people and the attempts to repatriate Sudanese asylum seekers. Also, South Sudan got mixed up in this. U.S. sent Mexicans to South Sudan, other nationalities, and it's all sort of prisons for hire, which is part of the larger issue of the Trump administration. But we had an interesting smidgen of a development in recent weeks when MBS made an appeal to Trump to pay attention to Sudan, and that's what got us to the small progress we had in September. And unfortunately, however much you dislike Trump or dislike MBS, it's probably going to take MBS pulling Trump back towards Sudan to have any further progress towards settlement of the Sudanese conflict, as Washington doesn't seem to be able to get its act around paying attention to Sudan. Now, on the sanctions side, the sanctions have been generally negative for Sudan and haven't stopped the RSF from getting weapons. But the devastation to Sudan of the war itself and all the destruction of the human capital and the war economies displacing the normal economies has made it that the war itself is a far more devastating economic impact on Sudan than the sanctions. And there needs to be a flood of humanitarian assistance as Suad was implying. Now, I would quibble slightly with something she said. I don't think they all left in 23. I think they were leaving by 24. I think the first year of the conflict, because I know a lot of people that worked on this, there were huge negotiations going on trying to get things into the ports of Sudan and then down towards the capital. And there was quite a bit of humanitarian aid getting in despite the blocking of it by both sides at the time, although it was worse on the RSF side, and the bureaucratics of getting the aid in because of the way in which it was sort of mishandled and mismanaged. But as Suad said, it was pretty much gone by the time the Trump administration came around. And now we're at the point where there just needs to be a ceasefire forced and a massive flood of humanitarian aid in. Because if we don't have another flawed but necessary ceasefire and another flood of aid in, we're going to see a level of destruction beyond even what we're seeing now. I'll stop there.
Thank you. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to combine a couple of questions because they're very similar. And then we have a question here regarding the NBA Basketball League, which I just read about today. I want to touch a bit on that. But the question would be the roles of Turkey and Saudi Arabia. What's in it for them? Would you say that there's a proxy war between Egypt and Turkey on one side supporting the SAF and the UAE supporting RSF on the other side? With that being said, is there a way that Saudi, Egypt, and Qatar can put pressure on the UAE to stop this agenda from continuing? Suad, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just first just point to the framework that there is a difference between a country having allies and a militia being a proxy militia that would not be able to operate, that would be dissolved without its funders and its arms and fighter provisions. So the question was around Saudi and Egypt having diplomatic pressure. So unfortunately, as Dr. Lawrence mentioned, I think he can speak more extensively to Saudia's leverage here, because it seems to be the only voice that Trump will listen to around Sudan, which was, to hear that, because Trump's exact line was, I never heard about this country, Sudan, before until NBC told me about it. And I found that very unusual because there were ongoing negotiations led by the US on to determine Sudan's fate throughout his administration. So for him to not know about the country that his administration was leading these talks around is pretty substantial. I will say around ceasefire deals and the precedent of U.S. agreements in Africa is very clear around the Congolese deal that Trump just bartered, to which it doesn't hold Rwanda, the UAE equivalent in Congo, which is funding and arming the militia, the M23 militia there. Doesn't hold Rwanda at all accountable, does not impose any type of arms embargo or consequences on Rwanda or any accountability mechanisms for Rwanda to be instigating this genocide in Congo. And it was purely for Trump's own personal profit and resource extraction deals for the U.S. So these ceasefire, there's a reason why Sunni civil society are demanding an arms embargo, are very clear about the desire for an end to militia violence and genocide through holding the UAE accountable, through stopping the UAE in its facilitation of this genocide. Sudanese people want civilian rule. They don't want military governance. They want to live free. They want accountability for war crimes from the military and from this militia. They want dignity, safety, and the ability to live on their land without fear. So the demands of Sunni people have been remarkably consistent throughout this period. Military back to the barracks, ousting this militia, UAE out of Sudan. And there was a flood within the past week of protests on the ground throughout Sudan calling for these exact demands, and reiterating that a militia cannot govern a country. So we must listen to those voices on the ground that are yelling for us to be consistent with with the narrative around Sudan.
Well said, Suad. That was amazing. We're close to ending, but we have quite a bit of things. I would like to suggest that the people who are in the background running this, if they could take down some of the questions in the chat that we can forward to our speakers, and maybe we can get some written responses to them, because I really want to get down to what we can do. There's a lot of activists on this call, and we want to make sure that we can touch on things that we can do, whether it's out protesting or some campaigns that are being run, that we can work on in phone banking groups or whatever resource that we have available to us. So if we could do that, I would like to start with one of the questions in the chat because it talks directly about a campaign. From Mr. Heller, he's asking if there could be a campaign mounted to shame the NBA basketball league for taking UAE money and renaming it mid-season, the competition, to the Emirates Cup, I'm sorry, should be Club too. Perhaps recruit some NBA players maybe. Where do Manute Bull and, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce this name, Lual Deng stand? These players are Sudanese. We could certainly do something here. If that was something feasible, we could put some people hopefully together to try and work on this. But If both of you could take like a minute each to talk about that, that would be great.
Suad, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so there is already an ongoing campaign to pressure the NBA. It's run by Refugees International, and they were petitioning the last I heard. We joined their organizational petition to pressure to pressure the NBA, and it has been remarkably successful because a lot of the UAE's power is the soft power that they have through these corporate deals. And so, the NBA commissioner, after we wrote in the New York Times about how the NBA's connections here, he was confronted with that information directly within a press release, and he stated specifically that he was looking into NBA ties with the UAE. Of course, this is going to be a huge battle because the NBA is deeply entrenched, has this really huge sponsorship partnership with UAE. But this is really essential, these kind of corporate these pressure campaigns for corporations, because that's much easier to do than larger larger things. One larger thing that actually there's a huge campaign around is the UAE arms embargo bill. As those within the US, we have an obligation to act to end the arms that are being manufactured here that are flowing into the UAE. And there's ongoing arms embargo bills in both the House and the Senate that the Congresspeople are looking for other Congresspeople sign on and support for. And so if you should look into if you're so we have a CARE, we've partnered with CARE on a website, bit.ly/sanction RSF, that has a filled message that you can send to your congresspeople about what's going on and why they need to support the particular UAE arms embargo bills in Congress. The phone banking, I think, would be extremely great. If you would like to be involved in any organizing efforts around the arms embargo, please do reach out to us. We have a form to join us on our website as well. And I hope that you'll. I'll put the link for the arms embargo script in the chat as well. Thank you so much, and thanks for having me, and thank you to Dr. William Lawrence.
So I'll piggyback on that. I know we didn't do too well on answering the Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi question. I'd be happy to take that as an email. And on the, but I'd like to focus on UAE just for a moment because it's key to what we're talking about now. The UAE develops most of its crazy policies out of mercantile interests, making money in a whole variety of ways, including smuggling gold out of Sudan, stolen gold, and using it to help support Russian sanction beating and these various groups that it's supporting, not only in Sudan and Chad, but all across the Sahel and Libya, Yemen, you name it, UAE's meddling. But the motivation in their mind is they're sort of obsessed with the Muslim Brotherhood, and any Muslims that look like the Muslim Brotherhood are again portrayed as the Muslim Brotherhood, and they're willing to scorch anything that they think might help the Muslim Brotherhood, and that includes democratic systems.
I
and
think
now
we
they're
might have
directly
lost
involved.
your
Can you
feed,
hear me?
Dr. Lawrence.
Can you hear me?
I can hear him.
Yeah,
We
I can hear
him.
you
We can hear
guys.
him.
Yeah.
Or
It
am
may
I
have
the
been
only one
you.
that can't hear, or can you
Yeah,
guys hear?
you dropped out a minute ago, so maybe you had something on your side. But what I was saying was that they're willing to destroy any system, any
Yes, you can
democratic
hear.
system, any open system, in order to get their way. Now I know from previous arms boycotts against UAE that has somewhat limited traction in Congress, but it can help, and naming and shaming UAE does help. But I would also take a page out of the Gaza handbook, because 2 years ago, there are very few pro-Gaza voices in the U.S. that had any, currency in Washington beyond a few. And now the majority of Americans believe a genocide is happening in Gaza. The majority of Americans are opposed to, are more pro-Palestinian than pro-Israeli in their political viewpoints, according to all the recent polling. And that was grassroots efforts. So almost, that was 1 million small efforts by Americans all around the country, sort of unwinding what decades of the Israeli lobby had accomplished. There is no strong UAE lobby in Washington. The way the Israeli lobby works to poison U.S. media and make it and to criminalize speech against Israel all around the United States. And so anything you do at the local level to raise awareness about Sudan, and anything you do, whether calling your congressman or supporting NGOs that are doing relief, any gesture you do can become part of the wave that puts Sudan in the forefront of people's minds, that can have a positive impact over time. So I would strongly encourage people to get involved, locally in what people are doing in their area, and go to work, because we have to roll up our sleeves and get more done.
Well said. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are at the 9 o'clock hour right now. Unfortunately, we didn't get through many of the questions, but so much was answered and very powerful. I thank both of the speakers. We will take you up on answering some of the questions through email, and maybe we can have you back here again to do a part 2 or another piece on Sudan, because it's very important. As Dr. Lawrence also mentioned, for people, we can do things over here in the United States to speak up on Sudan, lobby, join any of the efforts that are happening that Suad had mentioned and dropped into the chat. Thank you both so much. I appreciate everything that you guys are doing now. Continue to do so, and please keep us informed. And we'll definitely be emailing you guys with some further information that we can share with our attendees tonight.
Thank you so much. Thanks for hosting this. And thank you for everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for all you do.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Lawrence. Bye-bye. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence, Suad. Thank you, everybody. This was great. Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.
Assalamu alaikum.